On a misty September morning in 1745, the rolling fields outside a small Scottish town witnessed something extraordinary. Government troops, trained in the disciplined formations of European warfare, stood in neat lines with muskets gleaming and bayonets fixed. They faced an enemy unlike anything in their military manuals. Across the field, Highland warriors gripped ancient swords and round shields, their war cries echoing through the dawn air like thunder from another age. What happened next would shatter British confidence, prove that centuries-old tactics could still devastate modern armies, and transform a Highland uprising into the most serious threat the Hanoverian crown had ever faced. The year 1745 found Britain stretched thin across the battlefields of Europe. The War of the Austrian Succession had drawn the bulk of British forces to Flanders, leaving Scotland defended by inexperienced garrison troops and raw recruits. It was precisely the opportunity that Charles Edward Stuart, the young pretender to the throne, had been waiting for. From his exile in France, he watched as British regiments marched away to foreign wars, leaving the homeland vulnerable. In July, he made his move, sailing for Scotland with little more than 7 companions and an unshakable belief in his destiny. The British government had grown complacent about the Jacobite threat. The failed uprisings of 1715 and 1719 seemed to prove that Highland rebellion was a relic of the past, easily crushed by modern military might. The Marquess of Tweeddale, Secretary of State for Scotland, dismissed early reports of Charles's landing as minor Highland disturbances that local forces could handle. This fatal underestimation would cost them dearly. While politicians in London debated whether the threat was even real, Charles was already gathering the clans at Glenfinnan, raising his father's standard, and proclaiming the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. The Highland Charge that would soon terrorize government forces was no mere wild rush of untrained warriors. It represented the sophisticated evolution of Celtic warfare, refined over centuries and adapted to the realities of 18th century battlefields. Highland warriors had learned to incorporate firearms into their ancient traditions, creating a devastating combination of old and new. The charge began with disciplined formations advancing within musket range, typically around 60 yards. At that critical distance, the Highlanders would fire a single devastating volley, creating a thick cloud of gun smoke that obscured the battlefield. As the smoke billowed across the field, something extraordinary happened. The Highland warriors seemed to vanish, disappearing into the grey haze like spirits of the mist. For government soldiers trained in European linear tactics, this moment of blindness was terrifying. They strained their eyes, trying to peer through the smoke, knowing their enemies were somewhere in that grey wall but unable to see where. Then came the sound, a sound that would haunt survivors for the rest of their lives. The Gaelic battle cries served a dual purpose in Highland warfare. For the warriors themselves, the collective roar unified scattered clan contingents into a single terrifying force, raising their energy and courage for the final assault. But for their enemies, the effect was psychological devastation. Imagine facing a wall of men screaming war cries in an ancient tongue, their voices carrying the fury of centuries of clan warfare. The sound alone was enough to break the nerve of inexperienced troops, and when combined with the disorientation of the gun smoke, it created panic in even veteran formations. As the smoke began to clear, the true horror of the Highland Charge revealed itself. The warriors emerged from the haze like demons from the underworld, their muskets discarded, swords gleaming in their hands. Gone were the neat formations of moments before. The Highlanders had condensed into dense clusters, gaining momentum for the final rush. Each warrior carried not just a sword, but a complete arsenal of close combat weapons. The basket-hilted broadsword protected the hand while delivering devastating cuts. The targe, a small round shield, was strapped to the weak arm, designed to catch enemy bayonet thrusts. In the other hand, a dirk or dagger waited for the intimate work of close combat. The timing of this transformation was crucial to the charge's effectiveness. 18th century muskets took precious seconds to reload, and the Highland warriors had calculated their assault to exploit this vulnerability. As government soldiers fumbled with ramrods and powder, trying desperately to reload their weapons, the Highland warriors closed the distance with terrifying speed. The plug bayonets of the era made the problem even worse, as soldiers had to choose between shooting and preparing for hand-to-hand combat. They couldn't do both simultaneously, and that indecision proved fatal. When the Highland warriors reached striking distance, their centuries of clan warfare training became apparent. This wasn't the formal swordplay of European dueling masters, but something far more brutal and effective. The Highland technique involved taking the enemy's bayonet thrust on the targe, while simultaneously delivering an upward thrust with the broadsword, targeting the torso where armor was weakest. The ferocity of this close combat was unlike anything in European military experience. While continental armies fought with discipline and restraint, Highland warriors brought the savagery of clan feuds to the battlefield. The man chosen to face this Highland fury was Sir John Cope, a competent officer whose career had prepared him for European-style warfare, but not for the ancient violence about to be unleashed upon his troops. Cope commanded between 3,000 and 4,000 soldiers, a force that should have been adequate to crush any Highland uprising. Yet his army carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. Most of his troops were inexperienced recruits who had never faced combat, let alone the psychological terror of the Highland Charge. His dragoon regiments, supposedly elite cavalry units, were filled with men who had joined for the uniform rather than the fighting. Even Cope's artillery, the technological advantage that should have given him dominance over sword-wielding Highlanders, was fatally compromised. His gunners were a makeshift force of invalids and sailors commanded by a single-aged gunner. These men had never trained together, barely understood their weapons, and would prove utterly useless when the moment of crisis arrived. Cope had sent a message to Edinburgh Castle requesting proper artillery crews, but the replacements never reached him. He would face the Highland Charge with broken weapons manned by broken men. The Jacobite army gathering to face Cope's forces was itself a fascinating mixture of old and new. While popular imagination pictures the Highland army as a wild mob of clan warriors, the reality was far more complex. Yes, the core of the force consisted of Highland clansmen who brought centuries of martial tradition to the battlefield. But the army also included Lowland Scots, English Jacobites, and several hundred French and Irish regular troops. This diversity of backgrounds created tactical flexibility that would prove crucial in the coming battle. The organization of the Jacobite army reflected this complexity. Clan contingents maintained their traditional structures, with chiefs leading their kinsmen as they had for generations. Yet these ancient formations were integrated into a more conventional military hierarchy, with the prince as commander-in-chief and experienced officers like Lord George Murray providing tactical expertise. The result was an army that could combine the shock power of Highland warfare with the strategic thinking of European military science. As September 1745 progressed, these two very different armies moved toward their fateful encounter on the fields outside Prestonpans. Neither commander fully understood what awaited them in the coming battle, but the stage was set for a collision between two military worlds, ancient and modern, that would determine the fate of kingdoms. The night before the battle, both armies made their final preparations under a canopy of stars that seemed to mock the violence about to unfold. In the government camp, Sir John Cope consulted his maps by candlelight, studying the terrain around Prestonpans with growing unease. He had chosen his position carefully, placing his forces on what appeared to be defensible ground, with his flanks protected by marshland that he believed impassable. His officers assured him that the Jacobite army would have to attack frontally across open ground, where disciplined musket volleys could cut them down before they reached the government lines. Yet Cope's confidence was undermined by reports trickling in from his scouts. The Jacobite army was larger than intelligence had suggested, and their movements during the day had been erratic, almost as if they were probing for weaknesses in his position. What disturbed him most was the behavior of his own troops. Veterans of European campaigns would have spent the evening cleaning their weapons and checking their equipment with professional calm. Instead, Cope watched nervous recruits cluster around their fires, jumping at every sound from the darkness beyond their pickets. Across the fields, the Jacobite camp presented a stark contrast. Here was an army that seemed almost eager for the coming fight. Highland warriors sat in circles around their fires, sharing whiskey and ancient stories of clan victories. The sound of Gaelic songs drifted across the night air, voices raised in the haunting melodies that had inspired their ancestors before countless battles. French and Irish officers moved among the clans, making final tactical adjustments, but they did so with the confidence of men who had seen the Highland Charge work before. Prince Charles Edward Stuart himself moved through the ranks like a figure from legend. At 24, he possessed the kind of charismatic presence that could inspire men to follow him into hell itself. His supporters called him Bonnie Prince Charlie, and on this September night, he seemed to embody all the romantic ideals of the Stuart cause. He spoke to clan chiefs in their own tongue, joked with common soldiers, and displayed the kind of personal courage that Highland warriors respected above all else. When he promised them victory on the morrow, they believed him with the fervor of religious converts. But it was not just inspiration that drove the Jacobite preparations. Lord George Murray, the prince's military commander, was conducting a masterpiece of tactical planning. Throughout the day, local guides had whispered to him of a hidden path through the marshland, a narrow track known only to those who had grown up in these fields. As darkness fell, Murray made a decision that would change the course of British history. Instead of attacking where Cope expected, the Jacobite army would use the cover of night to circle around the government position and strike from an entirely different direction. The night march that followed was a testament to Highland discipline and fieldcraft. Thousands of men moved through treacherous marshland in complete silence, guided only by locals who knew every bog and stream. Clan warriors who had spent their lives hunting deer through Highland glens found the midnight movement almost routine, but for the lowland and foreign contingents, it was a nerve-wracking ordeal. One false step could send a man into noise that would alert government sentries and waist-deep marsh water, creating ruin the entire plan. As the hours passed, the Jacobite army gradually worked its way around Cope's carefully chosen position. By dawn, they would be attacking not from the expected direction, but from the government army's exposed flank, turning the entire tactical situation upside down. The marshland that Cope had counted on for protection had become the avenue of his destruction. It was a maneuver that demonstrated the crucial advantage local knowledge could provide, and it set the stage for one of the most devastating tactical surprises in British military history. When the first grey light of September 21st began to filter through the morning mist, government sentries finally spotted movement in the distance, but what they saw defied their expectations and their training. Instead of the Jacobite army arrayed in front of their prepared positions, enemy forces were visible on their eastern flank, having appeared as if by magic during the night. Urgent messages raced back to Cope's headquarters, and the general realized with growing horror that his entire defensive plan had been outflanked in the darkness. Cope's response demonstrated both his competence as a military commander and the impossible situation he now faced. He immediately ordered his army to wheel 90 degrees to face the new threat, a complex maneuver that required discipline and training to execute properly. Under ideal conditions, with veteran troops who had drilled together for months, such a movement might have been accomplished smoothly. But Cope's army was neither veteran nor well-drilled, and the confusion of the early morning redeployment created exactly the kind of chaos that the Highland Charge was designed to exploit. As government forces struggled to redeploy in the growing daylight, the Jacobite army completed its own preparations with ominous efficiency. The various clan contingents spread out in their traditional formation, each group maintaining its ancient identity while contributing to the larger tactical plan. Cameron men stood alongside MacDonald's, Stuarts beside Macpherson's, their clan banners snapping in the morning breeze like colourful prophecies of violence. French officers checked their pistols while Irish veterans fingered the hilts of their swords, all of them watching the government forces with the calculating gaze of professional killers. The artillery pieces that should have given Cope a decisive advantage instead became symbols of his army's dysfunction. His makeshift gun crews struggled to position their cannons to face the new threat, but their movements were clumsy and uncertain. These men had never worked together as a team, and under the stress of combat conditions, their lack of training became painfully obvious. When they finally managed to load and aim their guns, the first shots went wide, accomplishing nothing except to announce that the battle had begun. That single artillery volley would prove to be one of the most catastrophic military signals in British history. For the Highland warriors waiting across the field, the sound of cannon fire was not a threat but a trigger. The moment they heard those guns speak, every clan chief knew that the time for waiting had ended. Swords rasped from their sheaths, targes were raised, and thousands of voices joined in the ancient war cries that had echoed across Scottish battlefields for 1,000 years. The Highland Charge that erupted across the fields of Prestonpans was everything that centuries of evolution had made it. This was not the crude rush of untrained barbarians, but the refined culmination of Highland military science applied with devastating precision. The morning mist still clung to the ground, adding an ethereal quality to the advancing warriors as they moved forward with the inexorable power of an avalanche. The opening moments of the Highland Charge unfolded with a terrible beauty that would haunt witnesses for decades. As the clan warriors surged forward, their initial advance appeared almost leisurely, a deceptive calm before the storm. The Highlanders moved in loose formations, their plaids flowing behind them like battle standards, each man armed not just with weapons, but with the accumulated fury of centuries. Government soldiers watching from their hastily repositioned lines felt their mouths go dry as they counted the approaching figures, realizing with growing dread that these were not the ragged rebels they had been told to expect. The distance between the armies closed with mathematical precision. Highland chiefs had calculated every yard, timing their approach to maximize the psychological impact while minimizing their exposure to musket fire. At 100 yards, the advancing warriors were still beyond effective range, their movement steady and purposeful. At 80 yards, government officers began shouting orders, trying to organize volley fire from troops who had barely learned to load their weapons properly. At 60 yards, the moment of truth arrived, and the Highland Charge transformed from tactical movement into supernatural terror. The Jacobite musket volley erupted like thunder, hundreds of weapons firing almost simultaneously in a coordinated display that spoke to months of preparation. But this was not the scattered shooting of untrained rebels. French military advisors had drilled the Highland regiments in proper volley techniques, and the result was a wall of lead that swept across the government lines with devastating effect. Men fell screaming, clutching shattered limbs and torn flesh, while their surviving comrades stared in shock at the carnage wrought by warriors they had dismissed as primitive. Then came the smoke, billowing across the battlefield in grey clouds that transformed the morning into nightmare. Government soldiers found themselves firing blind into the haze, their musket balls whining harmlessly into empty air while their enemies vanished like phantoms. The acrid smell of gunpowder burned their nostrils and throats, making it hard to breathe, harder still to think clearly. In that crucial moment of blindness, the Highland warriors discarded their firearms and drew the weapons their ancestors had carried into battle against Roman legions. The war cries that erupted from the smoke were unlike anything in the experience of Cope's soldiers. These were not the disciplined shouts of European armies, but something far older and more primal. Gaelic words that had not changed since the days when Celtic warriors painted their faces blue and charged Roman shields carried across the field with the force of ancient curses. Men who had never heard the language still understood its meaning perfectly. Death was coming, and it spoke in tongues their grandfathers had forgotten. When the Highland warriors burst from the gun smoke, they seemed to have transformed into creatures from another world entirely. Gone were the loose formations of moments before. The clan contingents had condensed into tight wedges of flesh and steel, each group moving with the coordination of wolves hunting in packs. Their swords caught the morning light like captured lightning, while their round shields bore the painted devices of clans whose histories stretched back into legend. These were not soldiers in any sense that European military manuals would recognize. They were the living embodiment of a warrior culture that had never truly been conquered. The government dragoons stationed on Cope's flanks took one look at the approaching horror and made an instant decision that would echo through military history. These mounted troops, supposedly the elite of the army, turned their horses and fled without firing a shot. Their panic was infectious, spreading through the ranks like plague. Colonel James Gardiner, a veteran officer who had fought with distinction in European campaigns, tried desperately to rally his men, but found himself abandoned by soldiers who valued their lives more than their honor. He fell mortally wounded, struck down while attempting to stem a rout that had already begun. The collapse of the cavalry exposed the government infantry to attack from multiple directions, transforming a tactical engagement into a massacre. Highland warriors poured around the flanks of Cope's army like floodwater, overwhelming a broken dam. The neat, linear formations that worked so well against European enemies became death traps when surrounded by warriors who fought as individuals rather than as part of a machine. Government soldiers found themselves fighting for their lives in a dozen separate melees, their training useless against opponents who seemed to anticipate every move. The Highland technique of sword and targe fighting proved devastatingly effective against men trained to use bayonets in formation. While government soldiers struggled to coordinate their movements, Highland warriors flowed around their weapons like water around stone. The targe caught bayonet thrusts with practiced ease, while the Highland broadsword found gaps in enemy defenses with surgical precision. These were techniques passed down through generations of clan warfare, refined in countless feuds where survival depended on individual skill rather than collective discipline. Sir John Cope watched his army disintegrate with the helpless horror of a man seeing his life's work destroyed in minutes. His carefully laid plans, his defensive positions, his superior numbers, all proved worthless against an enemy that refused to fight according to European rules. As Highland warriors cut their way through his ranks, leaving trails of dead and wounded in their wake, Cope realized that he was witnessing not just a military defeat, but the collision of two entirely different concepts of warfare. The artillery that should have dominated the battlefield fell silent as its crews fled or died at their posts. The great guns that had been dragged across Scotland to crush Highland rebellion sat abandoned, their muzzles pointing uselessly at empty air while the battle raged around them. Some pieces were turned by Highland warriors and fired into the fleeing government forces, adding insult to the injury of complete tactical collapse. The very weapons that symbolized modern military superiority became trophies for warriors who fought with tactics older than gunpowder. As the government lines crumbled, individual acts of heroism became lost in the general catastrophe. Here and there, small groups of soldiers tried to maintain their formations, standing back to back as Highland warriors circled them like sharks, scenting blood. But these pockets of resistance were quickly overwhelmed by enemies who showed no mercy to those who had come north to crush their ancient way of life. The battle had become less a military engagement than a settling of accounts centuries in the making. The rout that followed was as complete as any in British military history. Government soldiers threw down their weapons and ran, trampling their own wounded in their desperation to escape the Highland fury. Officers who had boasted of crushing rebellion found themselves fleeing alongside the common soldiers they commanded, their authority evaporating like morning mist. The road back to Edinburgh became clogged with desperate men, many of them wounded, all of them broken by an encounter with warfare that belonged to another age entirely. Cope himself barely escaped capture, his military reputation destroyed in less than 30 minutes of combat. The general who had confidently predicted the swift suppression of Highland rebellion found himself galloping towards safety while his army dissolved behind him. Stories would later circulate of his undignified flight, of how the man charged with defending government authority had abandoned his post at the first sign of real danger. Whether these tales were fair or not, they reflected the complete loss of confidence that followed the disaster at Prestonpans. The battlefield after the Highland Charge fell silent except for the moans of the wounded and the triumphant cries of Jacobite warriors examining their prizes. Where a government army had stood in neat formation minutes before, only scattered bodies and abandoned equipment remained. The speed and completeness of the victory stunned even the Highland warriors who had achieved it. They had expected to win, but few had imagined that modern British forces would collapse so completely before their ancient tactics. Prince Charles Edward Stuart surveyed the carnage with the satisfaction of a man whose boldest dreams had suddenly become reality. The government army that was supposed to crush his rebellion lay scattered across the Scottish countryside, its survivors fleeing toward England with tales of Highland invincibility. In a single morning, the young pretender had transformed himself from a romantic exile into a serious claimant to the British throne, and he had done it with tactics that Caesar's legions would have recognized. The echoes of Prestonpans rippled far beyond that September morning, transforming a Highland uprising into the greatest crisis the British crown had faced in decades. Within hours, news of the impossible victory spread across Scotland like wildfire, inspiring wavering clans to join the cause and sending shockwaves through the corridors of power in London. The government forces that had seemed so formidable on paper lay broken, their survivors carrying tales of ancient warfare that could still shatter modern military might. The Highland Charge had proven that centuries of tactical evolution could overcome the supposed superiority of European military science when applied with precision and courage. Yet this victory also contained the seeds of its own limitations. The very tactics that devastated Cope's inexperienced troops would later meet their match at Culloden, where disciplined forces trained specifically to counter the Highland Charge would write the final chapter of Jacobite ambitions. But on that misty morning at Prestonpans, none of that mattered. For 30 minutes, Highland warriors had turned back the clock of history, proving that the old ways could still triumph over the new, that courage and tradition could still split the will of empires.